This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hey people, welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast where we speak to an animal studies scholar about a piece of their work. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan and I do like knowing animals. Well, it's a new year. Welcome to 2020 and we still have our fabulous sponsors. So this episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by AASA, the Australasian Animal Studies Association, and AASA will continue to be doing fabulous work in 2020. It's a non-conference year for AASA, but there'll be plenty of activity on the website, plenty of activity on the Facebook page. So think about becoming a member of AASA. Membership is very affordable and it will kick off your new year in the perfect fashion. Now this episode is also brought to you by Animal Publics. Have you checked out the Animal Publics book series yet? There are many beautiful animal-related books coming out of Animal Publics. Now, it's part of the University of Sydney Press. They do wonderful work. They're always adding titles. And you can even go back through the back catalogue of Knowing Animals and have a listen to me interviewing quite a few of the authors with Animal Publics. So check out the Animal Publics book series. Okay, let's get to the show proper. Well, it is a very smoky, quite warm day in Sydney town, and I'm actually not in my normal podcasting apartment. I'm in an artist's studio, which is very exciting, very different for me, and I'm really lucky to be joined by someone who's actually a colleague of mine because he's at UNSW, but we only met for the first time today. So there you go, still plenty of wonderful, interesting people for me to meet at my own institution. So this week we're joined by Fernando de Campo, who's an associate lecturer at UNSW Art and Design. And now Fernando often goes by Fer or Fernando, but we can have a chat about his upcoming exhibition, the Kookaburra Self-Relocation Project, and it's going to be part of Mona Foma in Launceston in Tasmania, and the show's going to run from January 17 to 19, 2020. So if you're listening to this episode hot off the press and you're able to get yourself to Launceston, I think you'll be very much rewarded. But we'll say a lot more about that during the episode. Welcome to the podcast, Fer.
Thank you, Siobhan. Thanks for having me.
So why this work? Tell us what led you to do this work.
Sure. So before talking about the work specifically, I'll talk about how I kind of get here. My research is really focused on the history of introduced species, and how we can hold up a mirror to the human and how we think about our own histories and the way we've defined the animal critically through the way we've mobilized the animal. So the interest in that and the understanding of that comes for me from a bird watching practice, which I inherited from another artist, Raquel Ormella, who also works a lot with animals often, along with other research interests. And Raquel, when I was just finishing art school, would take me bird watching with her, and eventually we did a bird watching related project on Bruny Island in Tasmania in 2011, during which I was a curator of that project, during which I started keeping a list. And I started bird watching on, I think October 4th, 2011. My first bird was a golden whistler. So that began for me a kind of way of thinking. I had a history with animals prior to that. I was a wildlife carer when we first migrated from Argentina to central Queensland. I was going to become a wildlife vet, but the course didn't start at James Cook till a year after I got into art school with a scholarship. So I went to art school instead, and I kind of never left. But that birdwatching moment started the way of thinking about my relationship to birds around me in my everyday. When I relocated 2 years later, after working with birds in my work and other things mainly to do with post-migration histories and post-colonial critique, which was a big interest of mine until that time, and still is, I relocated to New York to do my master's. And I'm from Argentina, originally migrated to Australia, moved back to the Americas, thinking about the migration of birds vertically up and down continents, thinking about maybe some birds I'll see in New York that might be reminiscent of my time in Argentina, maybe some birds, new birds that I had often looked for as a way of understanding a landscape. So I started keeping a daily bird list as a way of reconfiguring my relationship to a new locale. What happened was that the birds I saw every day were house sparrow, rock dove, mallard, sometimes European starling. And these birds made me feel at home, and that affection, that affinity was really complicated. That's been my research ever since. The realization that the non-human animal was able to carry an affect that really affected me in that moment, and that affect was both to do with a multi-species encounter in the contemporary everyday, but also to do with a colonial history. That those things coalesced, and that it carried that history. So I felt at home in Brooklyn because I had encountered that house sparrow in Melbourne, in Tasmania, in Buenos Aires, before I started keeping a bird list. So that's been the kind of glue of my work. To push forward, I'll kind of skip an ongoing relationship and research project on the sparrows for another podcast. But to jump forward to the project for Mona Foma to do with kookaburras. Kookaburras were introduced to Tasmania and Western Australia in the 1880s to 1907, a narrative that most Australians don't know, especially Tasmanians or WAers. When you tell them, they're quite shocked. The main reason they're shocked is because this bird probably affects them a bit differently to the sparrow. It's what I would argue that introduction was a nationalistic introduction. It predates federation. It happens by the same acclimatization societies that 30 years later had introduced sparrows and foxes and trout and rabbits. Then they get used, and one of the main reasons that's recorded for introducing house sparrows is to block out the uncanny and frightening sound of Australian bird life. So if you think of cockatoos and kookaburras, that would probably be an uncanny bird sound for an English settler. 30 years later, they seem to like the kookaburra and they decided we must homogenize the nation with this sound. So there's this moment that kookaburras are introduced to Tasmania, and you could say a form of laughter entered the landscape. Of course, that's not laughter. That's what we anthropocentrically call laughter. The bird's just doing what the bird does. But I became quite interested in this kind of sonic experience and how Tasmanians think of the kookaburra. So a lot of my work has been researching the archive of this narrative, the missing archive of this narrative, that the animal is often not present in its own human-written history. Interestingly, the Launceston City Council was really involved in the introduction of kookaburras because they were setting up a colonial zoo. And at the time, at the kind of end of the 19th century, when these zoos were being established, like Taronga Zoo, Melbourne Zoo, very similar histories, Perth Zoo, they were all what came from acclimatization societies, which were really obsessed with introducing species. They then shifted to this kind of species as showroom. It predates environmentalism as well, so it's a bit earlier. But they didn't have any money, so they would do swaps, which still zoos are very known for doing swaps. And kookaburras were swapped for thylacine puppies. So Launceston Zoo had the large, something like 65 thylacine puppies came through Launceston Zoo, and they would send them to the mainland, what Tasmanians call the mainland Australia, for other animals. So that's how kookaburras first arrived. The work I'm doing for Mona Foma is an extension of an ongoing work titled Who's Laughing Jackass? Laughing Jackass was the colonial name for kookaburra. And the work is called the Kookaburra Self-Relocation Project, Who's Laughing Jackass? It proposes this speculative idea that we're just hearing a plane. That noise is a plane because we're in the inner west.
Inner west of Sydney.
Some people call it the Marrickville Pause. So the kookaburra, the work is about speculating that the kookaburra might self-relocate itself back to the mainland, and it speculates on all these questions to do with the mobilization of species, the myth of the nation state of Australia in relation to one of its things that defines it is its force fiction of the kookaburra being endemic to the entire country rather than its natural range. It makes Tasmanians question what it means to hear that sound. What does an alien animal sound do in a natural environment? And it does this through a series of abstractions that I develop in the studio with painting and textiles. And then we're going to be working a lot with performance and laughter.
Wonderful. Well, I'm just wondering, so we've got a lot of international listeners, and I'm just wondering if we should take a moment to say a little bit more about the kookaburra, perhaps describe the way the kookaburra looks and sounds and their habitat prior to European colonisation.
Sure. I'll do a very novice version of that because I'm not an expert in any of those things. And maybe to explain that as well as the background is my main thing is producing artworks and these kinds of other forms of research inform the way that my main research, which is how can a critical, like contemporary art and practice-led research ask critical questions of the world and our position in the world. So there's a kind of a bit of a privilege and a responsibility of the artist in a way to be able to borrow from these other disciplines, but to be able to, ask the critical questions and be sincere about that process. So in terms of my knowledge of the kookaburra and how I engage with it, the kookaburra is the largest kingfisher in the world. It was called Laughing Jackass until the John Gould the Book of Birds, which called it the Laughing Kookaburra, which borrowed back its Aboriginal indigenous name. It does, for international listeners, anyone who's been to Australia first hears a kookaburra, they might think it's a monkey or a crazy man laughing in the bushes. It is a really maniacal, really kind of corporeal sound. It comes from really deep. It does not sound like a bird to most people, but we're quite used to it in Australia. It's quite large. It has a very strong beak. It would catches lizards and rats and would steal food from other birds and from humans. Recently, a laughing kookaburra stole a sandwich from my mum's hands at the beach in the Sunshine Coast and then smashed into my face. And its plumage is really tertiary. It's browns and greys mainly, with speckling of baby blue on the wing and really beautiful like burnt sienna on the wing. So it's the plumage is very specific to my artwork because the first iteration of this artwork was called The Colours of Federation, Who's Laughing Jackass. And now the second iteration for Mona Foma is called the Kookaburra Self-Relocation Project, brackets, Who's Laughing Jackass. So Who's Laughing Jackass is a kind of, play on words. I put it, it's like, who is this character laughing jackass, but also who's laughing at who's the jackass in this kind of narrative. And at the same time, the colours, the colours of Federation in Australia are based on the Union Jack, or the green and gold of the golden wattle, which was also introduced across the country to kind of confirm this national myth. So this work kind of proposes that actually the colours of the Australian Federation could be browns and greys and baby blue and baby pink, rather than the myth that we have as a palette.
Yeah, it's really fascinating, your work, and I had the opportunity to read through a conference paper that you gave fairly recently, and you touch on a whole range of themes. And I mean, I have to say, I consider the Australian history I did at school to be terribly lacking. Certainly there was no mention of anything or any of these happenings. But for me, one of the themes I saw in your conference paper was this notion of the kind of the challenging, complex nature of distributing animals to send these different messages, and in a way contradictory messages. And so you, in a sense, juxtapose the kookaburra against the sparrow and what that means and what that concurs. Having thought about all this relocation project, how do you understand it? Is it nationalism? Is it consistency? Is it arrogance? What's it about?
Yeah, great question. So, what's interesting for me, which has been a big research focus lately, is that the question of the animal and how the animal is defined is actually central to these decisions. Because a human... So, to take a step back, all these introductions until the kind of 1920s, where introductions are clearly occurring for environmentalist reasons, and that is a different history that we know a bit more about, maybe, or it's more clear. Like, introductions are happening because, so we have introductions for agricultural reasons, for recreational reasons, like hunting the fox, hunting the rabbit, hunting the fox and the rabbit, the sheep for agricultural reasons, recreational, environmental reasons, like 1920s sort of onwards. But prior to that, what's really interesting is that these introductions are based on a definite acceptance or understanding that the presence of that non-human animal affects the human. And that's, for me, really interesting because that's not flagged, but there's no other and it's like what I argue is a kind of colonial affect, not just a kind of like colonialist gesture. Of course it is, but it's not like just because London had it, but it's more because they made the settlers feel at home elsewhere. And I think that's quite complicated because that suddenly shifts into a nationalistic affection for the Kookaburra. It kind of happens naturally. An example of this would be one of the first house sparrow introductions that happened in Australia was in a little town called Ararat in Western Victoria. It was a gold rush mining town. It must have had some aristocrats in the 1860s because a few months after the sparrows arrived in Melbourne, they arrived by horse and cart in Ararat. And this story was republished nationally after it happened. And the story goes that the locals locked up their cats to come and watch the townies be released off a balcony. And everyone talked about where the sparrows were nesting and what they were doing for days. And so the townies, took me a while to work out, was a word they were using for sparrows. And soon after that, 10, 20 years after that, every article that comes out in regional Australia and everywhere about sparrows is about how to kill them. They're obsessed. They're obsessed with poisoning them, and the poisons don't work, and it's full of anthropomorphic slippages because they talk about the birds being too smart and they know where the poison is and they know what to eat. But prior to that, it was his affection for the bird. And I think that's really complicated. I think from an animal studies conversation and from the question of the animal and how it's being defined in that moment, it's really like an extension. Particularly these birds are like, it's like they are, the sparrow is considered, in my research, like an extension of the human in that moment. It's like the human couldn't imagine the sparrow without. There is some writing that talks about such animals as cultural followers. In the Americas, the sparrow was introduced into Buenos Aires in the 1870s. So 1850 to 70s is when the sparrow introductions happened. And the sparrows were introduced to make Buenos Aires, which is where I'm from Argentina. Buenos Aires looked like Paris. But the English were putting in the railway at the time. So the sparrows followed the railway from Tierra del Fuego, which is the southern point near Antarctica, all the way to Venezuela through the Amazon, just by following the construction of the railway. And the sparrows survived. They were able to do that.
It's fascinating, isn't it? I've got this kind of theory, I've got this idea in my head that when an animal thrives, humans become irritated. We like to thrive ourselves, but when there's 10 sparrows in the town, that's fine. When there's 10,000, they have to be killed. And it's very problematic because this is the work that we're doing. As soon as an animal dares to succeed, that they become an animal we want to kill. So one of the other themes in your paper is othering. Is there anything else that you want to say about how the animal helps us be human that we've not covered off on yet? Have we really kind of gotten to the heart of the way you use the othering concept in your work?
So one of the Well, so one of my ongoing intentions is to engage with the histories of the non-human animal in order to locate some decolonial methodologies in the studio, some decolonial ways of thinking. I tie the othering, the separation between the human and the animal is one of the main things that I tie into the colonial project, and the way that the colonial project occurred in a kind of the emergence of a hierarchy within the human itself. So trying to counter any anthropocentrism is automatically linked to potential counterings of potential decolonial methods. Now, anyone in the animal studies world knows that the countering of anthropocentrism is a kind of the impossible possible that we strive for. Certainly that is what I'm thinking about all the time. Artistic methodologies do have really interesting ways of allowing for some of that stuff to happen. In some ways, like for example, anthropomorphism becomes a really kind of anthropocentric but also productive way to lean into some of that really complicated conversation alongside a non-human. So that's been a really interesting way of thinking about. I've done some work where I've written as Sparrow. I've written scripts where the sparrow looks back at me and talks about my own birdwatching history and its own colonial history. And that was really productive. Again, it remains anthropocentric in a million ways, but it also was productive of some other new ways of thinking. A recent work, an ongoing and recent work, is that I've started keeping a daily bird list again. And eventually this will produce 365 paintings, some abstract, many text paintings, which are just the lists of these birds. And I just use the first word of each species name. So the work is purposely trying to interrupt classification and ordering, while also, again, it's this contradiction because it's the only form of one of the main ways that we would kind of gain knowledge from a multi-species encounter. When bird watching in the field, you're like, well, what was that, And you use these naming processes. So the paintings kind of interrupt that. For example, the word Australasian might mean Australasian raven, Australasian figbird. Trying to think what else has been, and then Australasian data, and maybe the painting might say Australasian 3 times, and that knowledge is lost. So the work starts to become more about a critique on naming than anything else. But what's been most interesting, maybe as a way to finish, has been that the process of keeping a daily bird list has made me extremely aware not just of my multi-species encounters in my everyday, which are maybe the species in my urban spaces. There comes another Marrickville plane moment. It's getting louder.
Our airport in Sydney is extremely close to the city, and it flies over the part where all the trendy people live.
I used to pause the television when it came over, so it's easy to pause. So, to what you said earlier, that humans become aware of species when there's too many and they're irritable. My daily bird list project has produced data that shows that really easily because of the species that I see in my everyday. So house sparrows are barely seen in Sydney now. I see them only if I'm at the Argo, New South Wales, or maybe around Circular Quay. But of course, white ibis, rainbow lorikeet, silver gull, they are our invasives, and there are native invasives, and that's a really complicated kind of definition of a species in the urban space that is really interesting with the daily bird list. But the main thing the daily bird list has made me so aware of is listening, and listening as a potential decolonial methodology and an anthropocentric gesture is something that I'm really interested in. I mainly make these lists from listening, and I've become a bit better at identifying species from listening, but I'm not that good. So there's a lot of things that aren't captured in my daily listening lists. And what's really interesting is recently I was in Singapore visiting family, and I was sticking my head out the apartment window trying to decipher what I was hearing, and I couldn't make sense of any of them. The Asian cole sounds like the common cole, but I don't know it. Their daily kind of, their daily city kind of junk bird is a Javan miner instead of an Indian miner. So it looks and sounds a bit similarly, but I don't know it. So I couldn't tick them off. I couldn't list them in a birdwatcher way. But what I realized was that I was certainly listening acutely and paying attention to multi-species encounters in that moment. And I started to write down, I'm not sure what I'm going to call it yet, but in the daily bird list, I was starting to write down things like definite, perceived, non-human animal, other, period.
Wow.
So that was a real shift in how there was a definite multi-species encounter that impacted me, that I was interested in recording, which really interrupts birdwatching conventions. That has a mnemonic, that has a history that I really pondered about, and that was based on listening, that did not require Western conventions of classifying and ordering. So that's takes me back to the Kookaburra work for Mona Foma and to the end of the Daily Bird List project. Once the paintings are finished, the plan is to install 365 paintings, and then they become scores for performances. This is for a show in 2021, a big show I'm doing in Hobart, and that show will have a whole program of musicians and choreography and birdwatching / history tours that I will give, and different ways that performance can activate these data. And this is why I've returned to the Mona Foma. We keep saying Mona Foma. It's Museum of Old and New Art Festival of Music and Art. So it's Tasmania's Mona annual winter and summer festival. It's a project for the summer festival that's in Launceston since last year. So the Mona Foma work is about reactivating all this research through performance and laughter and listening.
Wow, amazing. Well, I ask everyone who comes on the program to answer 5 quick questions. In your case, we might have to adapt the questions slightly depending on how well they resonate. But are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
Sure.
Okay, now the first question is, can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read? But perhaps we might think of that in terms of pro-animal artwork. Would that be more appropriate, do you think?
So, yeah, I don't know about the first, but definitely a really significant one that changed the way I think about my practice in relation to encountering the non-human animal and the possibility of listening and performance, was a work by Cecilia Vicuña, who is a Chilean poet and artist, now based in New York. She left Santiago in the 70s during the Pinochet period. A really important artist who's having a lot of attention lately. Following on my commitment to decolonialization, it's important to also mention these artists that have been doing really important work for many years and maybe only now starting to enter the art history canon. Cecilia's work was a group performance about communicating in between species based on the history of beavers being introduced to Tierra del Fuego, which is the southern end of where Chile and Argentina meet and glaciers flow or don't flow. They're flowing more, unfortunately, lately. And the beavers were introduced there, and the beavers are, the architects of and engineers of the wild. And also it was in partnership with Camila Marambo, who is a academic curator and artist based in Melbourne, also from Chile, and who started a collective called Ensayos, which is based in Tierra del Fuego. And it's it was a really amazing experience for the a project in Melbourne, which was just based on communicating through sound and leaning into non-verbal ways of thinking and communicating.
Wow, sounds amazing. So the second question is, can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote? But perhaps we should ask the first piece of pro-animal art you produced.
Sure. The most significant first piece that was quite, I guess, radical for me was the launching of an entity called the HSSH, the House Sparrow Society for Humans. I still make work as a HSSH sometimes, and the HSSH is just had a big stint in the States and is going back to the States. They do a lot of work in Brooklyn. And the House Sparrow Society for Humans was a way for me to process as an artist the amazing conversations I was having with animal rights activists, bird watchers, historians, librarians, archivists, birds, and how to start giving some form to this really generative discursive thinking about how the sparrow we could try to give the sparrow some agency in its own colonial history and in turn critique our own. So the HSSH produces symposia publications, artworks that are fictionally authored with the sparrows or by the sparrows. And I was saying before, an anthropocentric but very productive gesture for me.
Interesting. So question 3 is, if you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be? But you're also very free to say, an animal-related artist or both. It's up to you. Another aeroplane. This good old Merrickville.
That would probably be quite easy and quickly. Would be Giorgio Agamben and the idea of the anthropological machine and how it operates within us. It was at the time when I came across that text, it was really productive for me to understand how anthropocentrism was kind of ticking on. And I spent about 6 months deep in books trying to locate a way of exiting the human, which I then kind of accepted I couldn't, and I had a responsibility not to, but rather to address how I was positioning myself within that. But so that part of me locating this kind of potential counter-anthropocentric artistic methodologies and research processes was, a bit of an arm wrestle with Agamben, and that was,
Wow, sounds amazing. So what's the most important thing academics, or if you prefer artists, can do for animals?
I think artists have an opportunity to bring to attention things that otherwise go unseen. Academics, I'm an academic as well, but I teach within an art school, and I always say to my students, our role is to help you not make a better painting as such, but rather be the artist, the best artist you can be in the world, and actually work out what kind of artist you want to be and what you want to say, because artworks are able to ask critical questions. A good artwork is a question-making machine. So artists have the responsibility and the possibility to ask questions rather than answer them. I think it's really important for me to think of art as a research tool, and what art can do for animals is to lean into negotiating a lot of these spaces that are actually really hard. Similarly to film, and to literature and to other forms of, creative, particularly the kind of like speculative possibility and conversation across species. That's something that I'm forever excited about and forever entering the unknown with.
Wonderful. Well, if you had the power to change one thing about the non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
What a great question. I didn't pre-plan that. I wonder, because I was about to say, I'd love to talk to animals, but then I wonder if that would destroy my the magic of not knowing. I'll be happy if I could just talk to sparrows.
Okay.
If we could communicate.
Wonderful. Well, if that happens, let me know.
Okay.
If they want to convey anything in particular. Now, what are you working on next?
Sure. So the Mona Foma Festival, I think I've kind of mentioned these two things, but the Mona Foma work, which is happening soon in January 17th to 19th, there'll be a series of performances as part of that. That's really everything I'm working towards. That'll be the best way to finish. So during the morning, where we usually here at Kookaburra, you might bump into a group of humans acting a bit oddly through the town of Launceston, wearing the colours of the Kookaburra, the colours of the Federation perhaps, holding banners that you don't quite know what they are, but it's certainly some sort of protest/celebration. And these shapes and these colours are all based on the sentence, "Who's laughing jackass?" And then at different spaces in Launceston, the humans will attempt to communicate non-verbally and communicate with kookaburras, perhaps.
Goodness me, the people of Launceston won't know what hit them. So how can people find out more about your work?
Sure. So the best would be to go to my website, www.fernandoscampo.com. You can also go to the Mona Foma Festival website to look at the Mona Foma project, or the Contemporary Arts Tasmania website, because Contemporary Arts Tasmania is commissioning the Mona Foma artwork, and also Contemporary Arts Tasmania is where I will be doing the large exhibition in January 2021.
Wonderful. And I'll put a link to your personal website in the show notes, so you can go to the show notes and click on that. Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you.
And thank you to the listeners for joining us for Knowing Animals, a podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars and artists about their work. Don't forget, you can follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals. You can follow me at SO_S. We're also on Facebook at Knowing Animals. I'm on Facebook at Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan. And we also have an Instagram account. Finally, don't forget to leave a review on iTunes. Reviews make it easier for other people to find us, I should say. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals. For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.